In a world where war never ends, one man carries the weight of a generation, survivor of the battlefield, bringing you hard truths and hot lead, reviews from the locker, and trips to the meat grinder. Now he's taking you behind enemy lines, not into combat, into truth. Stories from 1st Recon Battalion, with no BS conversations. Marine veteran Brad Iceman Colbert, where legends tell it like it is. This is not just a podcast, it's a mission.
Hey, this is Brad Colbert with the Carry On Podcast. Welcome back. With me today, I have Dawn Herring, a clinician, a licensed marriage and family therapist who has over 20 decades of experience treating both military and law enforcement and is now segued into private practice. And I think that she's an excellent candidate to answer some questions today about veterans' health, where we've been, where we are, and where we might be going. So, Dawn, welcome. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brad. Good to be here.
Great. So what I'd like to start with is perhaps just a little bit more information about you. I mentioned that you are a licensed marriage and family therapist. However, an LMFT is not what most people are used to hearing. Most of them are used to hearing clinical social worker. So briefly, just tell me a little bit about your education, your background, and what the difference between those two are.
Okay. I am a master's level clinician and a licensed marriage and family therapist, which means that in my studies, we were studying really relationships and how to treat relationships. And we can treat them individually on behalf of the relationship, but we can also treat them as a family or as a couple. And licensed clinical social workers have a little bit of a different slant. They are not trained in the marriage and family therapy component as extensively. However, when we graduate, we are often interning at the same places and doing very similar work. So we are both considered psychotherapists, master's level psychotherapists.
Interesting. Okay. All right. And then when you started out, you took a fairly unconventional beginning. Tell us a little bit about what you first started doing when you were out in the field.
Yes. I was a few years into my postmaster's level training, and I applied for a job and got the job as what's called a prevention and education specialist. And this job is for the Marine Corps. And so I spent 3 years working for the Marine Corps as an educator, teaching stress management, anger management, communication skills, suicide prevention for the Marine Corps at Camp Pendleton in California. And after that, I went on to becoming a clinician. And then for the last 10 years of my 20 years, I was a clinical supervisor in a non-medical, green, as we would say, Marine Corps counseling program.
Now, in addition to military, you also did law enforcement work, though, as well. Did you not?
I do. I actually work with federal law enforcement now. And prior to that, I worked with county law enforcement. I worked with the sheriff's department as a contractor responding to cases that involved crimes against children or calls that involved children who may be experiencing trauma.
So I think all of that sort of culminates into a large depth and breadth of exposure to trauma, treating trauma, recognizing it. And I think that is what qualifies you in my book as somebody that would be able to answer some questions about veterans' health. So let's get into it. What do you say?
Sounds good.
So 20 years of clinical practice, 20 years of being face-to-face with trauma, obviously not every day, but I think that you've had a chance to witness firsthand what veterans go through, what first responders go through. And as far as I've understood it in our private conversations, trauma doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care what your gender is, what your race is, your age, your background. It is very difficult to pin down any precursors. Is that correct?
Correct. Absolutely. As some clients of mine would say, it would have been much easier if I would have been blind and had to wear sunglasses or walked with a cane. Then people could have seen my injury. But it's a very hidden injury. And that makes it far more difficult, I think, to be seen and heard accurately for our active duty and veterans.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because a lot of times we talk about this cliche of, it's not really cliche, but the popular phrasing is these invisible wounds, right? We have a broken arm, like you said, we have a missing limb or some type of physical malady. It's pretty easy to diagnose, relate to, understand, but when it's an invisible wound, right, externally, you have no basis of comparison. So with all of that to be said, I mean, what trends did you see during your time with the Marine Corps, such as changes in mental health referrals, diagnosis, or the types of issues among active duty Marines and sailors?
Well, I should also say that I had 7 years of broken time in which I was working solely with the civilian population. And I came back to the Marine Corps in 2007 because the Marine Corps had begun treating combat trauma. We then had the 0304 OIF and of course the Persian Gulf, but we were beginning to wrestle with how to treat trauma. And I had been treating trauma in the civilian community, and I wanted to come back to a population that I hold near and dear and do some of that trauma work. So I think even back in 2007, we were just beginning to try to understand what we were seeing. And it was more than just trauma. It was, blast exposure. There were just so many things coming together. And of course, people would come back from deployment and be handed this sheet to fill out to talk about trauma symptoms. And nobody dared fill it out. So everybody just said, nope, I'm good to go, so they could go out on leave. Nobody wanted to be held back in case they had any problem that could have been trauma, because it wasn't understood enough. And there was still considerable stigma around what does it mean to be traumatized? Am I going to be able to redeploy? So, yes.
It's because I experienced that same thing. Upon returning from deployments, there was always those 3 or 4 days of post-deployment classes, the reintegration classes, and the welcome back. And I always hated them, and I didn't want to do them. And it wasn't because I didn't want to engage, but it was very dismissive. I got it. I don't need the help. Thank you so much. I almost felt like they were just really touchy-feely beneath me. I just didn't need it. And I think that all too often is the tone that many of us take. And, we were talking about this privately. The institution, regardless of whether it's, a branch of the military service or it is a law enforcement, doesn't really care whether you're burnt out or not. And a lot of times it's two competing interests. The institution wants you to provide a service, and you, the individual, wants to provide the service. And as long as that service is being met, I mean, whether you're burnt out or fatigued or self-destructive is really a lot of times not their problem, I think. But I also think that, having said that, I think the trend is also swinging the other way. I think more and more people are filling out forms and checking those boxes. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think I watched stigma decrease considerably between 2007 and 2023 when I left. And people began asking for help, initiating help. Leadership had begun saying, you're a resource, you matter to us. If you're not well, then we're not going to do well, and we want to take care of you. And I think to the extent leadership could set that tone, and they did, I think much better throughout the years, people were more apt to seek services. Still, I found many would seek services toward the end of their career. They would get to a point where they would realize, I don't want to take all this stuff I've got to deal with me. in my retirement. So I'm going to start doing it now. But it was often within 6 months to a year prior to retirement that I would see folks.
And I think that's unfortunate, because if you could do early and often intervention, and I know you realize this, you would be so much better off at the back end instead of being, loading it all at the tail end when it was, I don't want to say too little too late, but there was not time for intervention. There was not time for unpacking a lot of those issues. We segue people out of active duty into the private sector or into the VA healthcare system. And I mean, sometimes they're just lost. They're lost into the system, right? Yeah.
And I think that it's a catch-22, because if people are constantly deploying, getting ready to deploy, coming back from deployment, the training cycle is so intense often that people really don't have time to sit down and do trauma work, for instance, because they have to keep everything compartmentalized in order to get back out there. So they're looking often for a time when they can just rest a bit and actually do the work. And so sometimes for some folks, that isn't until that last year before retirement. And even then, they find it very difficult to find the time.
Well, I think it speaks to the dwell time, that ratio of the amount of time that you are not deploying and the amount of time that you are either working up to a deployment or on one. And I think that it took the institutions a long time to realize what that perfect dwell time would be. And in the soft community, in the units that are extraordinarily highly sought after, rapid deployment cycles, and high intensity, short durations, they don't necessarily have that same dwell time afforded to them. I think we saw it a lot during the Afghanistan cycle. It's tapered off now because that geographical area is no longer at the forefront. But there's other ones that are starting to ramp up, taking its place. And my hope would be that we've learned enough from the last 20 years to put forth our best care in the future. And I wonder if we've learned during these last 20 years enough metrics from the trends to make changes. Do you think we have?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know what is ever enough, but I think that we certainly are better. All of the systems are better now than we were, I think, even 10 years ago. And, to be fair, the science is ever growing. So, for instance, the science on traumatic brain injury, that science still continues to grow. There's so much we don't know about traumatic brain injury, how to treat it effectively. Traumatic brain injury from breaching may be different from parachute jumps or concussive blasts. So I think, we're learning so much more about the brain as well. We're learning also about the immune system and what does this high allostatic load do to an immune system on somebody who's constantly in a high up tempo.
Yeah. And it's funny you mention it, because there was a recent publication by a doctor called Operator Syndrome. Are you familiar with the book?
Yes, Dr. Chris. Yes.
And he speaks a bit about that. If you're familiar with it, why don't you explain a little bit about what his research is indicating?
I think one of the things that struck me as a clinician when I read his book is that clinicians are often guilty of seeing what we see. We have our own internal bias. So we see depression, we see anxiety, and we assume that is due to a mental health issue. And I think one of the points that Dr. Frew makes is operator syndrome, as he calls it, is really this complex interplay of various health issues. And it could be from TBI, it could be endocrine, it could be low testosterone. And I know in my own experience, I've had clients who I referred for endocrine testing to their doctors because I was concerned that some of what I was seeing was perhaps mimicking depression, but not depression. And often they would come back with low testosterone, and even our active duty docs would medicate them. So, low testosterone can look like a major depressive disorder, and we don't want that. Also, I think one of the things that the operator syndrome book talks about is just sort of the chronic inflammation, the tendency towards substance use, maybe trauma, maybe not trauma. People are trained to do a lot of things that civilians may say are traumatic, and the operators may say, that's not my problem. My problem is I can't sleep.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, so as a result, there's probably a lot of self-medication, and there's a lot of correlations, but not causations as a result.
And sleep disorders, as we know, make people feel really not well, right? We don't function very well, Brad, without good sleep.
Yes. I've heard this from someone else before.
Yeah,
that's right.
So I think his point is that there's just a cluster of interconnected health issues that must be treated, and that the active duty or veteran must be treated more holistically. We can't just look at a mood disorder and say, here's the problem. If we have chronic pain, we have to look at that. If we have endocrine disorders, we must look at that. Family and relationship stress, right, for the high up tempo operator in particular, but also, 20, 30-year active duty person is going to have had most often a lot of time away from their family for one reason or another.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And I'm glad to see that is a venue that is starting to get explored a little more, because I think, as you said, we have progressed so tremendously in just the last 10 years, the last 20 years, really, since 2001.
Yes.
But then there are moments where you realize just how frighteningly naive we are about the mental health, about the brain, about physical trauma, emotional stress. And it's humbling in many ways to think that we're the most industrialized nation in the world, and yet we're babes in the woods when it comes to a lot of this stuff, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Humbling as a clinician, for sure.
Yeah. So, I was thinking a little bit about PTSD the other day, and we used to refer to it as shell shock, and a whole host of other names, from World War I all the way through Korea, Vietnam, World War II, all of it. And today we just codify it as PTSD. But in my recollection, one of my first exposures to what was now PTSD and what was then, shell shock was the movie Patton, where General Patton slaps the soldier in the hospital and says, "Well, you're nothing but a goddamn coward." I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to motivate the soldier to find the courage to get out of the hospital bed and go back into the fight. And of course it had horrible back repercussions. But what is Hollywood or this media get wrong when it comes to PTSD that you watch and you cringe and you wish people understood?
That's a great question. I think no fault of their own, perhaps, because they don't even know what they don't know. But I think there's a caricature of, an angry veteran with road rage, no anger management skills. And I think while some people could say that fits me very well, there are plenty of people with trauma and PTS who would say, that's not me at all. That's not me at all. I just struggle to get out of bed in the morning. I don't want to drive on the road. I'm not raging on the road. I just don't want to get on the road. So we've always said avoidance is one of the cornerstones of trauma. And I think anyone who notices they're avoiding, and they could be avoiding anything, family, going out in public. But just to know, I don't think that Hollywood's going to understand that often what we're seeing is an absence of behavior or, avoidance, for instance.
Yes. Yeah, that's so true. I think your avoidance descriptor is spot on, because a lot of times it's an uncomfortable thing, and we tend to shy away from that uncomfortable thing even without PTSD. So I'm sure it's exacerbated in the context of trauma. I know I have my own very simplistic analogy for PTSD that is probably going to make you squirm a bit, but would you mind if I basically explained it?
No, I'm dying to know. What
Okay.
is it?
Well, you've heard it before. So this is how my kind of brain explains post-traumatic stress to those that I have talked to that are not experts, such as yourself in the field. Our brains are like a giant file cabinet. And as we grow and progress, we encounter new scenarios, new experiences in life. We file them away. So I come upon a thing I've never seen before. The first thing the brain does is they go, okay, have we experienced anything like this before that we can reference it, that we can place in context? No? Okay, great. It's a new event. It's a new cataloged memory. Let's put it away. Yeah. And then you come upon something that is traumatic, a horrible car accident or a violent murder, or in this case of many of us in combat, you see and experience extraordinary acts of violence or stress. The brain looks at it, says, I have no frame of reference, and the folder lays open. So we move forward in the world, but that memory is still like a folder splayed open. Yes. So how is my description? Is that somewhat accurate?
I would argue that's not cringeworthy at all. And in fact, I've used something similar myself. And I think that which lays open and the brain doesn't know how to file becomes sort of this circular file that can be activated or triggered by just about anything, which then leads the body and the mind to have re-experiencing. And the goal of all trauma therapy, regardless of the modality, is to assist people to remember but no longer relive the experience. And that's such an important distinction. We don't want amnesia from it, although sometimes we may, but we want to honor the parts that need honoring, and we want to remember, but we don't need to be triggered by it or be reliving it. It is the reliving it that makes it very difficult to drive down the road, or to be triggered by sounds or sights or smells. And true trauma processing eradicates, to a large extent, a diagnosis of PTS because it's eradicating the activation of the triggers. Doesn't mean the memory goes anywhere, except the memory may go in the rearview mirror because it's in the past now. And that's what most people will say post-treatment. You know, an example I give sometimes is, has anyone ever had food poisoning? The brain will never want to eat or drink that thing again because it generalizes to keep us safe.
Or tequila.
But sometimes it overgeneralizes.
Yeah. So do you think then that PTSD, that healing from that trauma, it's possible?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't think I would have come back to work for the military had I not believed that, because it would be excruciatingly painful to sit with people and have no ability to move them, to support them, to assist them in relief. If there was no relief, we wouldn't be doing this work.
So tell me a little.
Changed careers.
Yeah, or at least been somewhat depressive in your own right. So with that in mind, and a body of work to your background, how do you go forward in treating PTSD? What do you think those modalities are?
Yeah, I think what we know to be true is there are really three basic evidence-based treatments for PTSD. One is called prolonged exposure. One is called cognitive processing therapy. And the third is called EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And so I think any of those three are effective for a person if they like that modality and it works for them. I tend to do more EMDR because I work with a lot of introverts who just don't want to talk about it. And another point is when there's trauma, there often is no language. There are no words to talk about it. If someone had to talk about it, sometimes they can't. So you can't do true talk therapy for someone with trauma until you give them some coping skills and stabilize their fight-flight system. Because when we're in fight-flight, we lose language. Our brain goes offline, so to speak, and we react rather than respond. So the first thing we have to do is stabilize someone to even do the trauma work. And my favorite, and anyone who knows me knows, is EMDR, because I found it to be exceedingly effective in a shorter period of time. And people get better and they're shocked. And, you know, I work with a lot of cynical people who don't think there's going to be anything that will help. And I'm fine with that because they're not going to be, they're not going to succumb to the placebo effect as easily.
Right, right. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about the three aforementioned modalities is they're non-pharmaceutical.
Absolutely.
And I think that is one of the things that is overdone in our culture is medicines and a prescription as a treatment sort of, as a default. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. And, there are times that I've recommended a client go speak to a physician about possible medication if I felt that their life was at risk or their functioning was so poor that we have to get some sleep on board before we can do trauma processing, or they're suicidal and we need to stabilize them before we do trauma processing. So it's not that I'm opposed to the medication, and I think medication is very important for many, but it's not the only thing, and it's not going to effectively treat trauma, most likely by itself.
Yeah, I think that's an upstanding position to have. And when it comes to treating trauma, I think that the EMDR has shown remarkable results. I understand that there's been some reticence in military medicine to incorporate it. I think that and I'm at the bleeding edge of my knowledge base here, so correct me if I wander off topic, but I think that most of the treatment protocols for clinicians has been CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, which, forgive me if I'm wrong, but doesn't have a great track record when it comes to treating trauma.
Well, I think it depends upon who you ask. I find that there is a place for CBT, but within the EMDR model, there is some CBT components. But in addition to that, there are mind-body components, because trauma is not just in the mind, it's in the body. I think Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, to address how we can more effectively treat trauma. And, people know, I think before they have an anniversary, when that old injury starts hurting again, and it hasn't for a year. Mm-hmm. And one of my first questions to them is, well, do you have any anniversaries coming up? And they're always amazed that the body seems to tell them when there's an anniversary. That shoulder will hurt, that hip will hurt, that knee will hurt. Something will hurt that seems that the anniversary of its injury is coming up. Yeah. So I always ask that because I think, and then, a trauma-informed treatment modality will help move that out of the body so they're not having such significant pain.
So what about the concept of moral injury and any treatment that exists to address that?
Yeah. I think moral injury is something we continue to wrestle with and learn more about. There are various treatment modalities for moral injury. I think the powerful thing for me about moral injury is it is not PTSD. And some of the authors who specialize in the research on this, Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz, talk about moral injury is a person experiencing or participating or witnessing events that go against their moral code. And so how does one wrestle with that? And so the treatment modalities that exist to wrestle with that are very specific to addressing the moral injury. In addition, they often will incorporate a spiritual component. I've often had people say, are you faith, or I've often said to people, are you faith-based? And if so, would you consider talking to a chaplain about this? Somebody who's going to have 100% confidentiality. And I think that's important, particularly if the moral injury was caused by someone perpetrating something that they felt goes against their moral code. I can't believe I did whatever it was. I'm a monster. And I think we have to be able to have those conversations and invite them and stand free of judgment and just encourage people to wrestle with them. And I think to be able to say it out loud to one person is profound.
Yeah, that's a courageous thing to actually step up and admit that there's been a moral injury for many people. I think that we'll do oftentimes the mental gymnastics we need to justify our actions, regardless of those around us and those that may be in receipt of them. So I think that's an incredibly difficult thing for people to admit and to come back from.
Yes.
I want to go back just for a minute because I think it's interesting for this. A lot of the people that may be listening are civilians. They may not have military context. And I think that what's the one thing that they often misunderstand about the mental health struggles of veterans?
I think for me, one of the things that I've often sort of made note of, even in my own work as a civilian, is if someone comes in for treatment and they tell me their deployments, I automatically have some assumptions about what it might be that traumatized them. And quite frankly, I'm often really wrong. The things that I think might be traumatizing are the things they were trained for and are, in fact, not at all what was traumatizing.
Right.
And so I think we have to always check our expectations because we, particularly as civilians, may assume that just because somebody was in a firefight, that's going to be the thing that's traumatizing.
Yeah.
And it may not be that at all. It may be having to kill a feral dog who could have had rabies, right?
Yeah.
And then coming home to your pet dog. So it's tricky.
It is.
Because it's often not what we think it is as civilians.
For me, it was children. There weren't many, but there were a few instances where I was witness to children either being wounded or killed, and that is one that is extraordinarily difficult.
Yes.
To carry home. Yeah.
Absolutely. With or without your own children. And then the present trigger is often, I come home and I see my children. I come home and I see my neighbor's children. I just come home and I see children. And it's a constant reminder, right? And people will say, I see it like it was yesterday. And that I see it like it was yesterday is that open file that hasn't gotten filed. That tells us that that's active trauma that hasn't been processed. People don't need to see it like it was yesterday forever.
Yeah, I think that's a positive message and a reminder that this is not a life sentence.
Correct. Correct. It doesn't have to be, but it's complicated.
All the good problems are complicated.
They are.
But so that covers. We've talked a lot about military. We've talked a little about law enforcement. However, recently you've been working with U.S. Forestry Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service staff. And so how do these experiences compare in terms of culture and needs and challenges to the military?
Well, I think one of the things that's similar is all of the, whether it's fire personnel, law enforcement, or military, these are all men and women who are used to going in to the fire rather than leaving, rather than retreating, whether that's a literal fire or a proverbial fire. These are people who are used to going in to the risk, not driving by the risk or avoiding the risk or calling 911 for someone else to handle the risk. So I think there's a component that makes each tribe very strong and very cohesive because they risk their lives every day in their own way. And they have their own trauma, and they have their own code of silence or suck it up. And I will say, in every arena in which I've been working, I see a tremendous growth in supportive leadership and a greater understanding of how important it is to take care of our people physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally.
It's interesting you mentioned the support system, because a lot of times I think we take for granted that trauma does not just affect the individual, it affects those that are in that individual's orbit. And that is, husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, children.
Yes, absolutely.
So how do you help families cope with the psychological effects that veterans may exhibit after deployment? I know you've been an educator, you've been a lecturer, you are currently a clinician, all with the green side. So
yes,
what do we do for our support network?
Well, I think family members are often the first to seek help, and it is because they've sought help that they are encouraging their active duty or their veteran to seek help. And I would say this is regardless of gender. Families notice and have their finger on the pulse of how their active duty person or veteran is doing. And they have probably had very many conversations with this individual long before that individual seeks help. So I always encourage everybody to get help. I encourage the spouses and the partners to get help. I think also when the parents both are doing well, the children don't necessarily need therapy. They often respond very well to a shift in the family system becoming more stabilized. But there are times when I think it's important for the children to have therapy and for the family to have therapy. So depending upon who I'm working with, I may encourage the other person to come in the room and have a session. If I'm going to be doing trauma work with an active duty person or a retiree, I may say, first of all, does your spouse or partner know you're in therapy? Because some of them don't tell them. They say,
Sure.
Nope, they have no idea. I'm going to do this on my own. And some of them will tell them. And then I'll say, well, is he or she supportive? Are they willing to come in to just a session so that I can just share with them a little bit about what we might be doing in here and what you might benefit from on the other side?
Right.
And I've had many a spouse say, what should I do? What should I do to help? And I always say, your listening is the prescription. That's it. It's your listening. You're being available, and you're understanding what that individual may look like on the other side of trauma processing for a day or two. And how
I think doing it alone is incredibly challenging. And you know this as being in the line of work that you're doing, but there's a reason why VFWs and other organizations are so wildly successful, because the one thing that many of us have, whether it's military or law enforcement or first responder, is that close-knit community, that family that you share all those hardships and bonds with. You segue out, you don't have it. And then you go home to your wife or your husband who you love dearly, but they just don't get it. They don't get it.
Yeah.
And so that becomes your new support system. So bringing them along this healing journey, I feel, is extremely important.
I agree.
Doing it alone it sucks.
It sucks. And, some marriages aren't surviving, all of this. And so how do we help people find a new support system? How do we help them find a new tribe of people when they do retire? So that they have a tribe and they have some sense of purpose and meaning. And I think it's incredibly difficult to leave the military and to leave law enforcement and then just go it alone and sort of be invisible to the rest of the world.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's that, I think, invisibility that pushes many veterans to that final solution. And it's a sensitive subject, but if I may, I've lost a couple of people
Yes.
recently that didn't have to go.
Yes. Yes.
There was one of them, a good friend of mine who was an active duty Marine, and he also worked with me for the government. And the last Thanksgiving decided that was it. And he's just one of many that I've known in my circle, and of course one of thousands. So why is this suicide rate among veterans so high? And from your perspective, what is not working?
Yeah. I wish I had that answer, right? If I had that answer, I'd retire early. I think it's multifaceted. I think we will not always know who's suicidal because they will not tell us. And if people hide it well enough, even if you see that person every day, there may not be a damn thing you could have done. That being said, when I would teach these suicide prevention trainings, I would ask that we call them suicide awareness trainings, because there's something about using the word prevention that makes us believe we have some illusion of control over others' lives. And
Wow,
I do believe, I do believe that
It's true.
despite the fact that we don't have that control, we have influence. And it is up to us to know the signs to the extent we can see them, to the extent someone allows us to see them, to see changing patterns and behavior. And really, to answer your question, I'm not sure. I think it's multi-layered. I think that there's probably a role of the sleep deprivation. I know plenty of people who can get fleeting suicidal thoughts just from 3 to 4 nights of not being able to sleep.
Right.
So sleep deprivation, the traumatic brain injuries, the blast exposures, endocrine problems, chronic pain alone. I always say chronic pain is like the infant that screams on the airplane right behind you, and there's not a darn thing you can do about it, and it won't stop. And we all know how how anxious we feel when we're in pain or when that baby's screaming.
Yes.
And chronic pain is like that. So I think if you layer enough things together in one human, and then you add on to that sometimes a childhood fraught with trauma that was left untreated, or a family history of some depression, a lack of supportive family could be a triggering event, a sense of isolation. Even people who have wonderful families who are available to them will say, I feel alone. Nobody understands me. And
but what do you say to that veteran that says that no one could possibly understand what I'm feeling, that you don't know what it's like to be me?
Yeah. Well, I gently challenge that. And this is where that CBT, that cognitive behavioral therapy, comes into play. There are a lot of conversations that we have challenging those beliefs, gently nudging them. Is it that nobody understands? Or is it that you don't understand? Is it hard to articulate to someone? So we engage in conversations with them and really sort of challenge some of that and really take an objective look at, who do you have in your life? Who is there? And if they don't understand, would they be willing to understand if maybe we could figure out a way to tell them? Have you tried to tell them? And sometimes it can be as simple as just saying, okay, I want you to go try to tell them and come back and tell me how that went. But if you haven't tried to tell them, and if they say, well, I don't think they want to listen, I say, well, do you want to bring them in? Should we tell them in here? And I think it's about saying, I will stand beside you while we'll walk beside you through this. So you're not alone. I'm here. And I'm not leaving you alone. And I may not understand, but I give a damn. So I think just layering those conversations is so important.
You're one of the few, though. And so I have to ask, you've been on both sides, you've been in the private sector, you've been on the military side. You've provided, recommendations and services and protocols to a lot of government agencies. Which one's doing it better? Do you think the private sector has it buttoned up, or you think that the government sector's doing a better job?
Well, I will say this. I will say I am very proud of how the military, and I think more specifically the Marine Corps, has done over the years, taking better care and better care. I think it's always a challenge because it's also about money. And a federal government, there's money. There are money problems. So the private sector, if we're looking at a big business and they have a lot of money, they can take darn good care of their people. They can offer EAP services. They can offer in-house workshops. So I think that's a hard question to answer. I fall back on how pleased I was just watching the military in just my one bird's eye view learn, and then let that learning inform their care. But federal will always have financial challenges that perhaps the private sector won't have, or may. Everybody's got their financial challenges. I know that may not answer your question.
No, I don't think it's a dodgeable question because I think it's an impossible question to answer. Because I think if one group had it more than the other, then the other one would plagiarize it, and I would hope that they would, right?
And we'd all have it, absolutely.
We would all have it. I think that, as you have already mentioned, and I'd just like to echo, I think that we have come light years from what used to be called shell shock to what now is a clinical diagnosis, and not a pejorative one, because for so long it was pejorative. And I think that both leadership and institutions are paving the way towards removing the stigma of treatment, removing the stigma of mental wounds, and encouraging operators at all level to hit that pause button, hit the reset button. And with that in mind, I want to try to find some. I don't want to silver line it, but some success story. What's one success story or transformation that you've witnessed that keeps you going in this work?
They're innumerable, right? I think almost everybody with whom I've worked has been a success story in one or in many ways. And so I can't really say one. I can say that as I watch people heal, I watch their relationships often heal. And as their relationships heal, the whole family system becomes more stabilized. The other piece to that, I think, is that we have to acknowledge, I'm going to take a tangent just for a minute and I'll come back. We have to acknowledge that aside from the trauma, there's a lot of just grief. There's grief for the losses to the men and women by suicide, in combat, to illness. There's grief for missed birthdays and anniversaries and holidays. There's so much grief. And I think just in general, civilian population or military, we are not, as a culture, and I guess this is a huge generalization, but we do not have a lot of rituals for grief. We're not good at it. We're not good at it. We have so many days you can take off for your grief, and then you got to come back to work, and you should, look alert. And I think just providing education to people that sometimes what might feel like anger and irritability is actually grief really can calm a nervous system and can help them realize I'm not crazy and I'm not an asshole. And perhaps I've been drinking my grief, So I think that piece is important. So there's really no one story because everybody's healing trajectory is so different. Yeah. But there's a composite in my mind. And we haven't even touched on military sexual trauma. And to help somebody to validate that experience, to help them heal from that experience from within a military system, I think was very powerful as well.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I definitely want to be respectful of it. But, there is still one more thing that I think people are curious about, and we kind of glossed over it. If you'll go back and talk just briefly about EMDR, I don't think that people are familiar with this treatment. Is it involve a bunch of equipment? Does it involve cables and electricity? And hey, what medieval practice is this EMDR you speak of?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm going to back up by saying that, EMDR is founded on some principles that include cognitive behavioral therapy, mind-body medicine, and neurologically how we're wired. So when we're sleeping, if we get REM sleep, that stage of sleep is designed to help us make sense of day's events. It's why some people say, I had the craziest dream last night, and it seems seemingly unrelated, or it's parts of different things. But REM sleep involves rapid eye movements, which tells us that the body has been designed to heal itself when we apply what we call bilateral stimulation. And the way the body does that during sleep is with rapid eye movements left and right. So the founder of EMDR started studying this back in 1987 and found that rapid eye movements while awake can calm the body down. Slow eye movements can calm the body down. Rapid eye movements are more effective even at helping someone process. And I say it's kind of why when runners go for a run, in addition to the endorphins, they may come back and say, you know what? I solved that problem. I figured it out. I feel better. So what EMDR does is it uses that concept of the eye movements to say, all right, here we have a traumatic memory. And there are parts of it you can't even speak of. And I'm not even going to ask you to describe it. I don't need to know, but you know. And we have an entire protocol that asks about, what is the negative belief about yourself as you think about fill in the blank? Mm-hmm. And if it's a traumatic memory or if it's a moral injury memory, there's almost always a negative belief about the self. I'm a failure. It's my fault. I should have done better. And then we ask, what would you like to believe instead? What would be more accurate? What would your comrades say is more accurate? I did the best I could. I didn't have control. I didn't know. And so we link that negative belief to the memory. And I ask people, the protocol says, we ask people, how true does that positive belief feel? It's not my fault. And people will laugh and they'll say, not at all, not at all. And when you think about it, what emotions come up? And sometimes people have words for that, and sometimes they don't.
But as you're doing this, you're also
we're not doing anything yet. Now we're just setting the stage.
Okay.
And then I may say to them, where do you feel that in your body? And almost always people can remember a traumatic event and say, I feel it in my, you name it, my gut, my throat, my heart, my fists. And so then EMDR adds some form of bilateral stimulation. It may be tapping, holding buzzers. It may be doing eye movements using just your own eyes on if it's virtual, one could do that on their computer screen. Could be using a light bar. Different clinicians use different, ways of doing this, but ultimately the way one does it has to be client informed. Right. Some clients want to hold the buzzer. Some clients want to use their eyes. So
I held the tappers.
Did you hold the tappers? Yes.
I held the tappers.
People tend to love the tappers. I've had people come into therapy without EMDR and say, just let me hold those darn tappers.
That's right.
Because on slow, they're very calming. And so then we process through that memory. And what people will often say, even in one session, is, when I go back and look at it in my mind now, it's quieter. My body's quieter. I feel lighter.
Yes.
And then they go home, and sometimes for the first time in months, they get a decent night's sleep, and they can't believe it.
Right.
So it assists the brain in processing more efficiently and effectively. So the brain is not left trying to sort this on its own, which, of course, if it can't sort by day, and we're avoiding it, so it won't, it tries to sort by night. And then we wake up, right? And people have bad dreams and they have nightmares. And so it's sort of like the brain is having a standoff. It's not able to do it on its own. And so EMDR just sort of holds the proverbial hand of the left and right brain and says, it's okay, we're going to do this together. I've got you. And we process through it. And at the end of it, the distress level has decreased significantly. And sometimes at the end of one session, sometimes it takes a few sessions.
Right. Yes, I've gone through EMDR myself, and it took not nearly as long as I thought it would be to process the issues that was being addressed. And it's not non-invasive, right? Like, again, it doesn't involve anything other than one or two, apparatus, if you will. And it, as you say, it's going to vary from person to person. And it's effective.
Brad, I want to add one thing about that too. And that is that there have been times that I've processed things with people who said, they couldn't even tell me what it was they needed to process because of security clearances. And I said, well, I don't need to know. I actually don't need to know. I need to know, do you have an image that represents the worst part of it? Do you have a negative belief? Is there something you'd like to believe instead? And never in there have they had to tell me what it was. So sometimes people aren't coming to therapy also because they're concerned that maybe because of their security clearance, they can't even talk about whatever it is. And I say, I don't need to know about it. Ultimately, I don't need to know about it. If you want to talk about it, I'm here, but I don't need to know about it in order for you to process it to a more adaptive place.
I just have a few more questions if you have the time.
Yes.
Yeah. Recently, there's been a lot of research in hallucinogenics, mushrooms. We're looking at LSD again, MDMA, and other new or revisited pharmacological solutions to some of these issues that people are facing. And we also have a emergent AI that is not replacing or supplanting clinicians, but it is providing some interesting sort of virtual CBT. I want to ask you what your thoughts are on those two sort of over the horizon technologies. I'm curious about
all of it. I wouldn't close my door to it. When I first heard about EMDR years ago, I was skeptical, and I remember very clearly rolling my eyes. And, I later had to eat my words because it became so effective. And I was actually encouraged to receive training from a psychiatrist with whom I worked, who I respected very much. So I will not be one to be critical of anything that we are trying. And I think in the right hands of trained providers, whether they are psychiatrists or, psychologists or other clinicians, neurologists, neuropsychologists, in the right hands, I think different things work for different people. And one thing I've heard about, that's not medicinal, but is the stellate ganglion block. And that seems to work very, very well for resetting the nervous system. So
you got to explain what that is, because I'm a little light on my,
I don't know that I can well
enough.
But there is an injection made in the neck into the stellate ganglion, and there's a block. Whatever is injected, God, I'm going to butcher this, but the stellate ganglion block stops that fight flight. I always say it's like downshifting a car. It stops that hyperarousal from being so chronic when nothing else works. And the people who've had this and for whom it's worked have said, after that, I felt calm enough and ready enough to do my trauma processing. So it may not be a cure completely, but it helps people be more comfortable in their body and not want to exit.
Does it also stop dissociative behaviors as well?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would suspect it could, because if we're not in hyperarousal, we're not going to tend to dissociate, right?
Which would allow your EMDR treatment protocol to move forward.
Yes, more quickly, perhaps.
Interesting.
So there are so many things on the horizon, and I think my advice to people is do your research, talk to people who do this work, ask them, how many people have they treated in whatever it is that you're curious about and considering, because I think that matters too. We need to be mindful of the experience of the practitioners, especially when we're dealing with newer modalities of treatment.
Right. So it's been a heavy topic, and this is definitely a serious subject, but it's also the one that's carried the most impacts to a lot of men and women. So what would you say then, if you could say something to a veteran that's maybe out there struggling, that doesn't want to come forward, that is dealing with this alone?
I would say there's hope. I think it's as simple as that. I would say there's hope. You can get better. You absolutely will get better. And often people think, I'm going to be the one for whom no treatment works. And I say, okay, well, I like a challenge. Let's do this. Let's see. But I would say you can get better. It is super important to find a provider that you feel comfortable with, that you feel cares, that you feel is competent, that you feel sees and hears you accurately. And that may not be on the first try. And I know it takes a lot of energy to even make a call and get into somebody, but you do not have to settle if the provider or providers are not a good fit. You can get up and ask for someone else. And please do that, because you deserve to be in an environment that feels safe, that you can even consider beginning to trust, and there's hope.
So I think, Dawn, one of the things we'll do is post a link to the EMDR list in this below. But what about those that may want to connect with you or learn more about your work? Do you have a website that I could
I will give you that as well to post, so people can have access to me as well. Yes. I generally use the Psychology Today website, and people can find that by just Googling psychologytoday.com.
That's awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate having this time, and I've appreciated listening to some of your thoughts and your feelings on, again, what is a very serious matter.
Yes. My pleasure, Brad. My pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. That's Dawn Herring, a licensed marriage and family therapist, veteran clinician of over 2 decades with military, law enforcement, and private sector. And we were talking a bit today about mental health, about veterans' health, treatment protocols, where we've been, where we are, and where we might go. So for Carry On Podcast, I'm the Iceman, Brad Colbert. Thanks.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.